Welcome to Consumer Connections, a podcast series brought to you by Scylla. I'm your host, James Piecowye, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Faisal Khan.
Consumer Connections is your guide to navigating the ins and outs of marketing and insights with a special focus on the Arab world and its global implications. We're thrilled to introduce you to a range of experts and leaders from the domains of strategy, marketing, and insights who will share their thoughts and real-life experiences with us. The theme of this podcast is marketing in the Arab region versus the rest of the world. Faisal, who is our guest?
Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Ruchika Kalra, a distinguished marketing and brand specialist. Ruchika has honed her skills across the globe, starting with Unilever and Red Bull in Dubai, then moving to Red Bull's global marketing role in Austria. Her journey continued in London with Reckitt as the global marketing manager for Durex, and presently she serves as the brand director for lastminute.com. I had the opportunity to work with Ruchika during her Red Bull tenure and can vouch for her extraordinary marketing acumen. Beyond her professional accomplishments, she's a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion, formerly heading the Global Disability Group at Reckitt and co-founding Wings of Angels, an NGO empowering people with disabilities. Get ready for an insightful conversation with the exceptional Ruchika Kalra.
Ruchika, this is an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast with us today. I want to kick off with a question about your journey so far, because as we've been saying, Unilever, Red Bull, Reckitt and Durex, brand director now for lastminute.com, Dubai, Austria, London. What a career.
Thank you.
Walk us through how this has all come about.
So if I think of it, some of it were very conscious choices and some of it was life happening. So I think when it comes to the choice of brands, I started my career with Unilever, which I think was a fantastic school of just getting the base right. So I think a lot of my marketing basics are right because of my time at Unilever. And then when Red Bull happened, I think that's when the transformational understanding of brands happened. Because what happens is when you are a big brand like Unilever and you have a lot of money and you have a lot of clout, the way you do marketing is very different from when you're a young brand like Red Bull. And I think if I think of brands in the history of, brands that have existed, I think Red Bull is probably an iconic brand. And so to be a part of that system, to understand why it performs the way it performs was revolutionary in my career journey. And why I'm saying this is, and I'll probably kind of talk more through this, in the rest of the podcast, but it's one brand that's so authentic that from the kind of people it selects to work in the brand, to the culture internally, to everything that externally, all the way to, like, I was sitting in Dubai, it's headquartered in Austria, all the way to how the brand looks in a small grocery store in Dubai is something that has been thought through and that has been strategized. Now it's not that no one has the ability to kind of localize it through those steps, but it's all very connected. So that was Red Bull, and that's what I kind of learn through my time at Red Bull. And then I think when I moved on to join Durex, it was again an exciting journey. I think Durex was at a point where it was rethinking and reestablishing itself. So I think Durex was a very young brand that did fabulously well. That, I mean, still is a market leader across some of the key countries in the world. However, along the way, as a brand, it started losing its, I wouldn't say equity, but a lot of smaller players started having very strong propositions and kind of eating away. So it was a brand that was trying to suddenly appeal to everyone from a brand that kind of stood very strongly for certain principles. And what I was again a part of was revamping or rethinking about what the core of the brand was and reestablishing ourselves to go back to the core. So again, I happened to be in that phase of Durex rethinking, repackaging itself. I don't know if you've probably closely observed, but there's a completely new package on ground when it comes to Durex. So I was a part of that journey. And then having worked with very big brands, very iconic brands through my life, I actually wanted to kind of put all of this to action. So, kind of put all my learnings to the forefront. And that's how lastminute.com came about. Like, I consciously wanted to, at this point of time in my career, work for a younger organization, almost a different field, which is tech, something I've never done before, um, to see how I can bring about principles that I've acquired from my consumer good understanding to this industry, which is very performance marketing driven, which is all about, your Google clicks and your performance ads. So how do you, in an industry which is so focused in performance marketing, then kind of come about and build those strong credentials? And luckily for me, again, for the understanding of the audiences, lastminute.com is not a young player, in the sense that in the internet world it's existed for about 25 years, and over the years it's been acquired by various travel companies, and over the years it's again somehow lost its credentials as the quirky, authentic British brand that it originally was. And the work that I'm doing with Last Minute in some ways is again very similar to, picking up the learnings from Red Bull, picking up the learnings from Durex, and kind of applying it here. So that's been the journey in terms of the brand front, or the choices, or the kind of roles I've undertaken. And I think from a geographical perspective, I mean, Dubai is home. Dubai is where my family is. So, I've spent most of my life in the UAE. And then there was an exciting role in the global headquarters of Austria, with Red Bull. And there was no reason to kind of say no to that. However, it was a very adventurous choice at that point of time. I am married. My husband was in Dubai, and I still remember the conversation when this role happened. So I asked him, I said, what do you think? Should I interview for it? And he said, listen, I mean, it's just an interview, go for it, and then we'll figure out when it happens. And it happened so quickly that actually, 2 rounds, 3 rounds of interviews in, I already knew it's happening. So I went back, I said, you still have a job in Dubai. This is almost coming through. How do we make this happen? And this was pre-COVID, and and pre-COVID and pre-kid. So, really adventurous in this point of time. And we say, he says, go ahead, take this job in Austria. I'll probably find a job somewhere in Europe. So not even like, Austria itself, because he was a consultant at that point of time. He knew he doesn't know the language. So, and he said, we'll meet in a new European city every weekend, and then that's what our plan was. And now when I'm saying it out loud, I know it sounds really super adventurous, but we said, okay, let's do it. So I reach Austria in this little village in the middle of nowhere. So I'm talking about 20 minutes away from Salzburg. So it was literally in the middle of nowhere. A beautiful village, but no people around, right? By myself, and my husband was still in Dubai at this point. So very early, like it was a big shift. I was born in Delhi, grew up in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, so lots of people, big city life, to this completely different little town that I moved into. So while from a career front, I think it was a very exciting move, also very quickly and very early on, I knew that I have to find my way back either into a big city, and also find my way back to Vikram and I being in the same city. So from a personal perspective, then London started making more sense. And then that's how London happened. And then I've been here for about, a little over 3-4 years now. So yeah, that's the journey on the switch of geographies.
What really excites me about this whole story you've just shared with us is the connection to this region, and the fact that you're so firmly rooted here. We're really curious how your experience from the Arab region, from the GCC, has influenced what you've been doing beyond here.
So I think what, being based out of Dubai gave me is a very strong understanding of how things work, one from a local perspective and from a regional perspective. Now, what happens is somehow when you move into global roles, just from the nature of how most FMCGs are, set up, some of your biggest markets are the European markets, or North America, for example. So while there is an extreme desire to amplify and grow in the Middle East and Africa, you almost in global roles lean very heavily on the local markets for that complete understanding. So I think, again, from that perspective, where I probably had an added advantage is a complete understanding of the developing world markets, the emerging markets, which are very, very different in terms of on ground execution when it comes to brands. However, if I think of if I think of people and marketing in general, the one thing I've kind of realized in terms of principles, that we're all almost the same. So when I think of, say for example, if I pick up
Hmm.
Durex, the most controversial brand that I've kind of worked on. Now, when we moved into the global role, when I moved into the global role, the one big thing that kind of kept popping up is that the Middle East is a very, very different market, because it's also very um, conservative in its way of thinking. Sex has a very different meaning, etc. However, when you kind of we did this massive piece of consumer research to understand consumers from a psychographic perspective. And what we recognized is that there are different types of consumers, but without getting into too much detail, there's a consumer group called open and curious. Now, these are consumers who are pushing the boundaries, questioning things, and kind of pushing the edge, etc. Now, open and curious for North America, or for say the UK, or some of the other European countries, could mean very different things than for what it means in the Middle East. But having said that, that segment exists. That means that they might be, for example, challenging some very, you know, like equal, like if we did a campaign, and I'm probably jumping from Middle East to India suddenly for an example. We did a campaign about the equality of orgasm for women. And now that is the level of open and curious in a country like India. In North America, it might be the equality of rights for different communities. So it might mean different things, but it is still the same principle. So to your question about what I picked up is, I thought going into this role that I would probably have a very different set of things happening in these markets. But I think the strength kind of starts happening when you connect all these dots together and realize that the brand is at an advantage when it plays globally yet locally. So, you know.
Hmm.
I think that's a
In
beautiful
that,
thought, Ruchika, because I think with the experience you've got across different markets, you talked about Indian consumers, you talked about the Middle East, Austria, European, London. I think the basic human insight is same, right? So a lot of
Absolutely.
things are premised, like the word you use, as principles, and the basic principles, the fundamental principles of human beings, and hence marketing, would be similar across. But then it's those manifestations that you pick out, those
Yeah.
nuances you pick out across the different markets, where you'd probably kind of make some tweaks around your tactical tweaks around the marketing strategies to kind of adopt to those markets.
So I think what happens sometimes is we kind of segment this, markets very differently, and then start treating them differently. But when it comes to data collection, I think the strength lies is when you can overlay the maps or the insights of the types of consumers and say, okay, what are the commonalities, and then define them as a consumer group. So this big piece of research that I mentioned just about Durex, for example, it was exactly that. So the research was done across several regions in the world, and then the big challenge back was, okay, how do we now map all of this together to identify, what are the commonalities? And then let's term these consumer groups based on the commonalities versus based on the differences. And then I think, if I think of the time at Durex or the time at Red Bull, you know, what it had was very strong principles of what the brand can do and cannot be touched. Like here, I'm talking about Red Bull, right? You cannot, for example, we Red Bull were never going to researching gives you wings. Gives you wings is a tagline. But what it would research is what gives you wings would mean for a market like Middle East versus a market like North America, and it could mean very different things. What it would kind of spend its time on kind of, localizing is how would this translate into events that could be very, very different for North America versus Middle East. But the principles of those events would still remain the same, that it has to be an authentic Red Bull event. It has to have the brand personality coming out. It cannot be your mass cliche events that every brand is sponsoring. So those principles remain untouched. But then there was a strong element of what could be touched. And I think those are the brands that then start appearing very authentic as well. Because while there's a connection with the local audiences, from a global perspective, they're still very tied down and very, authentic in what they're standing for.
It'll be very nice to actually also hear out some specific. I mean, you've been talking about the similarities and differences and the marketing strategies you did in, let's say, adopted in the Middle East versus in Austria or other markets, whether that was for Red Bull or Durex. Any examples of you remember very evidently of the kind of activities or initiatives or tactics that were adopted and worked really well in Middle East and those that actually worked there?
I think let me pick up an example of that I touched upon, earlier in the conversation, which was Durex. Durex was launching Mutual Climax, which is a condom for both partners, for the pleasure of both partners. However, for the longest time, I think when it comes to the voice of the woman, it's not as strong in regions like the Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc. Having said that, that was a historical perception. I think more and more women are becoming more and more vocal when it comes to topics, not just when it comes to sex, but I think when it comes to topics in general. And so, kind of taking on that insight, for Mutual Climax, the focus was influencers, who women influencers who went out there and spoke about their experiences when it comes to sex. And that conversation, because it's such a big conversation, kind of had a very natural, organic talkability to it. So this was even ahead of the launch of the product. Women kind of stepped up, and there were insights, right? About 70% women don't climax during sex, and women started speaking about this and started talking about the inequality when it comes to sex. And then all of this conversation, when it was organically being picked up or being spoken about, was probably the right time to set ground to launch a product like Mutual Climax for Durex. So on your question, on campaigns that work well, I think it's about being a little edgy, but also every campaign does not specifically always have to tie down to the product from the start. There has to be a little bit of build up, and I think insights, that again are able to help you take those kind of bold steps, are the ones then that eventually help result in campaigns that effectively burn. And Mutual Climax for India is probably one of the most successful launches when it comes to the brand Durex. So that's an example of something, that was very, very localized, but it was still pushing the boundaries from a global perspective. It was a consumer that is edgy, that is ready to step up. And then it kind of tied down altogether to the launch of a product.
Based on your experience, what do you find differentiates marketing in this particular region as compared to the other regions that you've been talking about, including India?
I'll talk about two things. When it comes to, there are two elements in the sense that the way things work internally versus the way things work externally. When it comes to the consumer, I think the emotional aspect of the consumer, the family value, the cultural traditions remain extremely important. However, there's also a very strong shift happening. Consumers are getting more savvy, more aware of their rights, of trends, and I think it's an interesting time when it comes for marketing, because you're not just speaking, because if I think of the perception of the region, people think this is a certain type of consumer that is probably more conservative, that's probably more tied down to the family, full stop. But I feel the consumer in the region is not unidimensional. There is multi dimensions to their personality, and they might be tied down to the family, but then they also are looking for new experiences. They are also going out there and kind of standing up for things that they haven't stood for before. So I think when it comes to the consumer in the region, how marketing is different is, I think, internationally brands need to recognize that the region is not one big region, is not one unidimensional region, and it has many layers to it. And the more brands kind of start unraveling these layers and start treating consumers more from a psychographic perspective, I think the more we will start winning with consumers within the region. So that's one aspect of it. I think also how marketing differs, I think there's an element of internal management as well. I think a lot of uh, international brands I'm talking about are not headquartered in Dubai. So what that takes on is a little bit of a round of approvals that you sometimes need to run for edgy campaigns. And so you almost sometimes miss the boat, because if I'm talking about an internet trend, and if I'm talking about a quick reaction campaign, if you need to go back and speak to headquarters and speak to international teams, by the time you come back to execute it, you've missed the boat. So I think also from that perspective, how marketing is different is that sometimes it's very methodical, planned, rehearsed kind of marketing versus reactive marketing, because the internal setups are not empowered enough to make those reactive decisions. However, brands that are winning are the ones that have kind of set these things up internally, that X decision can be taken by local markets, and by decision, you need to still consult with the international teams.
Okay, I want to link together these two questions. You've spoken about Durex in India and how this campaign really worked well. We've just spoken about how this region can be a little bit different and what needs to be done to think about marketing in it. Can you think of any marketing campaigns that have been done in this region that, unfortunately, because of what you've just been speaking about?
So I'm thinking about campaigns in general, right? Like, and let me tell you a little bit. Barring Ramadan campaigns, which we probably spend a big time of, as a marketer in the region, Ramadan is big. It's a time when people go out there and shop. So every single brand definitely have their Ramadan campaign, right? But outside of the Ramadan campaign, until it's a big launch that's happening, I think most campaigns are not thinking reactive and native. And I'm probably being very general. I've been out of the region for 5 years now, so please excuse me if I've missed out on some exciting campaigns. But let's think of channels on social, right? We have, I'm thinking Dubai. You have Time Out Dubai. You have Love in Dubai, which are at the helm of some of the social work that's happening. There's so many influencers within the region, right? When we're talking about things like TikTok, who can actually be speaking on behalf of brands in a very reactive way. Um, but somehow, some of those big reactive ideas that are being picked up from social and being converted into products are not happening in the region, but are happening outside of the region. So, giving you one example, there was a vodka and Heinz collaboration recently, where on TikTok someone said, this would make a great pasta sauce, and then they both collaborated, picked that up, and came up with a product. Now, imagining a scale of campaign like this within the region becomes very difficult because of all the reasons I just mentioned. So the smaller companies, for example, the local companies, probably have power to do something like that, but are not sitting on those kind of budgets. And the companies that are sitting on those kind of budgets have not empowered their regional teams enough to say, hey, there was a social trend, you can launch an innovation in 6 months or in 3 months based on that social trend, because there's such a line of approval that follows through. So yeah, I've kind of not answered your question completely, but given a more general response to it.
Ruchika, you mentioned about interesting. You talked about and touched upon the social media channels. You spoke about TikTok in specific, and of course, we've got Instagram, Meta properties, Snapchat, etc. How's that social media options of campaigning and marketing changed your way of working and doing things?
So I think when it first launched, I've interestingly been a marketeer when Facebook was still a big thing. So, we were very excited. If I think of my time at Unilever, we were very excited because we launched something big on Facebook, and then Facebook moved to Instagram, and then TikTok, and all of that. I think when it comes to social media, sadly enough, I think most of us have still not, as marketeers, fully cracked it, and I'll tell you why. Once upon a time, when and I'm talking 10 years ago, social media was an added kind of platform you would think of. So you think TV, radio, social media. However, today I think really we are living in a time you cannot be thinking of social media as an add-on. Every campaign, every idea that comes from a marketing perspective should have a social first lens, right? Like, how would this land on that screen of Instagram, or that screen of TikTok? But not just that. I think the second question here is, why would people share it? Because you're sitting and trying to talk about your brand, and I'm not talking about paid ads here. You're sitting and trying to talk about your brand in a place where people are there for entertainment. Their attention span is not more than 3 to 4 seconds, and so you have to find a creative way to be a part of their lives. And that cannot happen if you're trying to push a paid ad with a product only approach. So everything that we then think, every campaign that we first think of, has to be like, okay, it has to be organically entertaining, or organically emotional, or organically funny, and yet has to have an element of the brand kind of seeping in. So to your question about, you know, from from a social media perspective, I think marketers firstly need to have that big lens. But secondly, also, I think sadly on social media, a lot of things are just big buzzwords that we don't fully translate or understand. So what I mean by that is, when TikTok started taking traction from other social media platforms, everyone got excited about TikTok. But very few brands have still fully cracked TikTok, because just opening another social media channel and putting up the same content that you probably originally planned for Instagram, or even sometimes for Facebook, will not start appealing to audiences on TikTok. So then you are just another brand page. So I think when it comes to social media, the understanding of why each platform should exist, like what's the purpose behind it, and then what role can you play as a brand to be a part of the consumer's life on that platform outside of your product advertisements, is the second question I think that we probably need to start answering, as brands.
I'm just thinking aloud here, Ruchika. But for example, a brand like Durex, and for the cultural and the taboo around the topic of sex orgasm that you were speaking about a while back in the Middle East, would social media be a very important channel to kind of reach out to individuals where they're able to access content that's not necessarily like it's meant for individual consumption?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think interestingly, out of all the brands that I've worked, the one brand that has a very organic existence on social media is probably Durex. And I'll tell you why. Um, People are talking about sex on the internet. People are talking about sex on Instagram, on different platforms. It's just Durex then starts having a role to play very organically. Just talking about social media, let me give you an example. Um, GIFs, Giphy is a platform, and brands can launch their own GIFs. And again, from an insight, because consumers are talking about sex, when we spoke to Giphy, we recognized that hashtag Durex, hashtag sex are often used, and gifts are often exchanged when it comes to these keywords. So a brand like Durex has such an organic place to play that even without us existing, our brand exists. And so it becomes important for the brand to kind of step in and start being a part of that conversation effectively, one from a prospect, from a brand perspective, but even from a purpose perspective. Because again, this brand has a very strong role to play in the society. Sex education is not that predominant. People's perception of sex is so diluted that a brand like Durex can not just be there to have fun and entertain, but also educate. And and that's exactly what the brand has been doing on its social media platforms. So I think brands like Durex probably have the easiest, if I may say so, role to play on social media. However, when it comes to a brand like a Red Bull, an energy drink, right? Why should people even look at it on social media, right? But that's another interesting example of how they have
Right.
transformed the conversation beyond their product to the bigger purpose, to the thing that ties it all, which just gives you wings. And literally, if you go to Red Bull social media, you have limited, you do see the product, but you have limited things about the product. You have more about, people jumping off a cliff, people enjoying themselves at a party, but yet it all happens to kind of tie down and establish the credentials of the brand. And that's only because the brand has been set up in a way that kind of does that effectively. So social media has a very strong role to play, but most brands don't know what to do. So they either become very functional, start pushing their product, or they become so emotional and vague without having any credentials completely tying into the brand that they almost lose their way. And the brands that kind of do it well are able to balance the two in a way that they're able to exist in a space where consumers are looking out for something completely different, yet are able to become an organic part of the conversation.
Ruchika, how is AI starting to play into what you're doing?
I think, again, I feel like AI is a new buzzword, which everyone's kind of jumping on. And I think outside of the PowerPoint presentations that we've all been using AI for, I think where AI has started to play a role from a creative perspective is, supporting obviously in terms of copy, image designing, etc. But I think moving forward, AI will start playing a much stronger role, even in terms of assessing and analyzing consumer sentiment. I mean, historically, it was such a big. I mean, if you think of sources, you have enough and more sources, right? Like your Amazon reviews are a very deep insight already. If you think of the tech industry, your Google reviews, your Trustpilot reviews are all sharing a lot of information. However, from a insight perspective, because it's just so much data, converting all of this into anything actionable becomes a lot of manual work. And I think maybe that's why there's been a big gap. So I think moving forward, I think I see a lot of consumer sentiment analysis being very real time, and then marketeers taking advantage of that to be able to effectively confirm the work that they're doing is either making sense or not, and hopefully quickly adapt to it as well.
And that's a beautiful example you gave, Ruchika, because recently we were doing some work around using AI about on plant-based and what people think about plant-based. And typically you would rely on social media data, but in this specific case, the most richness of data came actually from Amazon reviews and Google reviews, especially Amazon, where they were talking about product specific experiences, about right from the taste to the viscosity to the aftertaste, and we kind of gathered that in millions of data points, and whether that's emotions associated, or what are the kind of positioning strategies, what are the white spaces around that specific category. It was for milk, plant-based milk, and it kind of threw up a lot of brilliant results. And you're right, so there are so many sources of data, and AI can actually tap into, whether that's Amazon reviews, Google reviews, ratings, in the travel sector, for example, all your third-party platforms. So there's a lot of richness, and I think AI really comes in handy in that.
I'd like to change gears just for a second, because we've been talking about marketing. We've been talking about your marketing career, and built into all this is the fact that you still managed to find time to be the co-founder of Wings of Angels, an NGO that's empowering people with disabilities. Tell us a little bit about Wings of Angels and how you've managed with what you're doing to found this NGO.
Personal passion project, and that's primarily because my younger sister, who's also my best friend, is a wheelchair user. My father has an amputed leg, and my mother very closely works with the people, children who have special educational needs. So disability is something that I've seen very closely all around me, and I think Wings of Angels specifically kind of emerged from our own personal issues of not being able to access places together, my sister and I. And so we decided to do something about it, and that's how Wings of Angels kind of came into play. We then just got a bunch of friends together, walked around the city, convinced people to build ramps. And then the ramps started popping up. And I think a big factor that was missing was the awareness and understanding. I think people think people with disabilities is almost a non-existent segment, or it probably is not something that's big in terms of numbers, etc. But interestingly, 1 billion people in the world, according to World Health Organization, have some form of a disability, which means if this was a hypothetical continent, it would almost be as big as Africa. I mean, it would be almost be as big as Africa, or we're talking about countries like India and China. So we're talking about huge numbers. It's just that you don't see people with disabilities around you, primarily because of two reasons. One, because of the lack of access. So if we are not enabling them to go out there and access places, how do you imagine to see them outside? And two, a lot of disabilities are hidden disabilities. So you might not know that this person has a disability, but it exists. So, what I think everyone needs to start becoming more aware of is that it's not something we can shy away from or brush it under the carpets or say, hey, when you visit our restaurant, we'll lift your sister up. That's not okay. We need to go out there as organizations, as individuals, and start spreading the awareness so that places start having all of these accessibility infrastructure in place so that more and more people can actually start living a full-fledged life that they deserve to live.
Ruchika, you want to just touch upon the achievements you've managed, especially here in this region? I know there's been a lot of hard work that's gone, and the number of
Sure.
ramps that have been extraordinary high.
So we've managed to build about 1,000 wheelchair ramps. But I think what also I think we're proud of is, I think the second thing that we're currently working on is connecting people with disabilities with the right jobs. So we've started working with organizations where they're open to hiring people with disabilities, and then kind of advertising that in our network. And I think if I think of another aspect, is just Shobika, my younger sister, as a living example of what you can do when you have the right basic infrastructure in place. Yesterday, Shobika did a skydive, and I think when just living and looking at Shobika live her life, I think probably is enough awareness for people to recognize that people with disabilities have a lot of untapped potential. And of course, for Shobika, she is able to do all of this with a lot of support. But then it should not be the case. It should be status quo. And so, in terms of achievements, I think even Shobika just living her life the way she's living her life as a TikTok influencer with 100K followers kind of makes me believe that every person with disability will and achieve their maximum potential if we kind of work with the right support and infrastructure that has to be given. So yeah,
it was great catching up, Ruchika. Some lovely conversation out there. Thank you so much for sparing the time.
Thank you, Faisal.
Thank you, Ruchika. It's been great meeting you.
Yeah, same here, James.
You have been listening to Consumer Connections, a podcast series brought to you by Scylla. The theme of this episode, marketing in the Arab region versus the rest of the world. Our guest has been Ruchika Kalra, brand director at lastminute.com.